somebody that contract manufactures something that somebody's developed and sold to some other country?
Well, that's, thank you for asking that question. I mean, I'm very passionate about that issue. I mean, the super big picture is you want innovation to happen globally because we need to solve these environmental problems globally. So you really kind of want the tide to rise on everything. Right? Having said that, you know, when you look at our country,
no, we don't. We want it here.
We want to be the innovators and the rewards and create jobs and get our fair share of that. And it's a tough race. I think we talk about energy policy as an important component. I think that would fix a lot of the problems and create markets here for innovation instead of. A lot of entrepreneurs are saying, I will now do a commercial entry into a market where they have better policies in the United States. So I see that as a big risk. But really, the risk aversion will drop dramatically once the velocity of the public markets comes back. You have an active IPO market, you have an active M&A market. The risk tolerance just tips over for a lot of investors because part of the reason for the risk aversion is the uncertainty about the time in the investment. So I tell investors that just keep a lot of dry powder ready because you don't know when the next round is going to be or when the next capital call is going to be. And so they're saying, okay, well, I'm only going to put this. One way to manage risk is just to stage it and say, oh, okay, instead of being 2 rounds and we go public or 2 rounds and be acquired, I may have to go 4 or 5 rounds and be acquired. Once you bring that in, the risk aversion drops because the certainty of an exit declines. I mean, that's a general statement. Every company is a little bit different. So really the policy I'd like to see big changes in our whole capital markets. And we're seeing some interesting stuff Congress is dealing with now, with allowing entrepreneurs to really solicit the capital because there's a big restriction on that today. So that would encourage some access, really at the very early stage, some access to capital. But I think if we could form policies to lower the cost of capital in the United States, get our markets back and get the financial regulation streamlined, that's going to do a lot of good to make sure that investment in the U.S.
How much lower is going to cost of capital go?
No. Debt capital is minus percentage, right, after inflation. But equity capital is still expensive capital.
This will pass. Markets goes in cycles, right? If you think back 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of crappy companies getting funded. There was a lot of junk getting funded. Now we're too tight. You see you overshoot both ways. We'll end up back in an equilibrium. I mean, you look at some of the companies that got funded back in 06, 07 in the sector, there was junk getting funded. And now it's too tight. That'll change.
So, essentially investors who have cash right now are looking out at the market. They're saying too much risk, not enough returns. Maybe I'll sit on my money. Maybe I'll buy down my debt. What do you guys think will, and I agree, it's the velocity and it will change. What will change it? How, what, when? What do you think? What's your crystal ball say in the next 3 to 5 years?
So what I see, I'm back on the East Coast a lot, and very different view than West Coast. Everybody really, really concerned about Europe and China. The fundamentals here, I think, in our economy are actually improving because there's huge overhang around Europe and to a lesser extent China. You go back east, the mood is just grim back there. We're so close to Europe and what's going on that we're almost frozen because of that. I think that has to get addressed one way or another. Because the fundamentals are actually getting a bit better in our economy. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. is considered very much a safe haven.
Yeah. You got to fix Europe. I mean, if Europe were to, worst case scenario, make a leap, what happened with the Canadian scenario, it would be beyond that.
No, John had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk quickly too, because the other thing I think that will change that, and it's interesting, we spent a lot of time talking about this natural gas glut and the fundamental impact that's having on the environment, the investing market completely, but that was a result of new technology development. Somebody invested in that, somebody spent time, had R&D groups working on that to develop those technologies that have completely changed the picture. And if you look at energy's history, the big movements in energy from one source of fuel to a cleaner source of fuel are all technology driven. Part of what else will drive this, I think, Mike, is the China and Europe thing are important, but I think as we start looking at things, there are only so many investment opportunities to go around, and there's a lot of money on the sidelines chasing those. It's not a bad time to be looking for that if you have a good company. And eventually the pricing for those investments is going to start to go higher and higher. That changes the risk-adjusted return profiles on those. And now you can start to explore, when you get into that range, some of the newer technologies. You start looking at that risk a bit differently than you do today. Now, does that take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? I don't know, but it will happen.
And you also see, I mean, innovation is happening inside of existing companies with cash flow. So there's a lot, I mean, fracking, you know, horizontal drilling happens, companies who have cash flow, and they have pushing technology. Here in this state, RE Silicon, I mean, you know, they really have innovated around how you make polysilicon for photovoltaics. They're exporting that product to China. I mean, so, you know, huge change, right? They figured out a way to make polysilicon for photovoltaics that uses 12% of the energy of the predecessor technology. And that is like that makes a big difference. And again, that was happening because they were willing to make some investments, test some stuff out there, build a little, you know, prototype facility on the site, and then say, hey, this works, we're going to scale it up out here. So, you know, we definitely see that happening here in the state.
Yeah, I was interested in Mr. Butler's comments about tech transfer, but from corporations rather than universities, because I think some people may think that just comes outward, but you can't proactively reach in and get it. And as Steve said, we agonize so much about tech transfer from universities, and by definition that's high-tech risk and not much comes of that. So I was curious, what sorts of activities or processes or channels could we all do more of to take advantage of this opportunity to tech transfer for entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, to take those, I think you said, orphan technologies out of the Fortune 500?
You know, I don't know locally where I see it happening down in Houston, right? Houston entrepreneurs are just going to the oil companies and cutting deals with them to get access to their technology. That's where I see the real center.
Is there a play up here or elsewhere in the West?
Well, you got to find a company that has that technology on the shelf.
I mean, intellectual ventures, that's their whole business model, right? They're running around gathering IP and then licensing it out. And so, I mean, which is another, you know, TerraPower, you know, that's an interesting example of where they made super risky, you know, expensive, but you know, big payoff if it works. And so, you know, they're able to attract capital to that. And that, I mean, because of the regulatory issues, that's probably going to first get deployed in China if they can, you know, get through their technology issues. So there are, I mean, there are still a few, you know, there are some technologies where the upside is so big that there are some folks who are willing to make.
The only company here I can think of that might have, you know, enough critical mass of interesting technology would be Boeing. I would think there's got to be some stuff somewhere in Boeing that's pretty darn interesting. How you access it, I don't.
But local entrepreneurs usually have some kind of domain expertise, and it really is almost secondary to where the corporate is. So it's usually what they should do is leverage their knowledge of a domain, and who are the companies, you know, that may have technologies in that domain, because they should be able to understand the markets that those are in and how to apply the technologies. And then it's just, you know, finding the companies, and they may not be in the U.S. They could be elsewhere. And Asia is being very active. Entities there are being very active in looking at. Well, they actually are very active in developing technologies too. So there could be some tech transfer coming, you know, this way. And it's kind of a strange concept to think, but it's starting to happen.
I know there's a question that the gentleman that I was going to go to Steve. Did you have one?
Yeah. Ian Berkheimer, I'm with Cascadia Capital Solutions. We're the largest nonprofit in the country that works with the heavy trucking industry to improve their environmental performance. And one of the things we're working on a lot right now is natural gas, CNG and LNG. But we're running into one of our challenges, so we're hearing about what's happening on the supply side. And the truck side, of course, has a huge amount of demand for fuel. So there's great companies actually right along the I-5 corridor. You've got PACCAR and Freightliner, and you've got Westport just up here, which is great for new product. But